America in the mid-20th century, roughly from the 1930s to the 1970s, was a place that was, in many ways, a place of boundless possibility. It was a time of questioning authority, values, and systems that had been in place for centuries. As religion began to lose sway and science seemed to provide answers, many people began to search in earnest for questions that had been thought settled long ago, such as, why am I here? What is the meaning of life? What is happiness? In this new frontier of seeking and exploring, it is not an underestimation to say that this was an era of characters. Jack Kerouac, Neil Cassidy, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Duke Ellington, Woody Guthrie, Sidney Poitier, just to name a few. This was a time of neo-frontiersmanship, 100 years later from the original westward expansion. Except that this time the frontier wasn't a physical place in the material realm, but a place inside the mind, the consciousness, the sense of existence. And this moment in time of American culture is perfectly encapsulated in an artist like Eden Abe. Vegetarian before the idea had even remotely penetrated Western consciousness, a long-haired embracer of Eastern religions multiple decades before not only the hippie movement, but the aforementioned beat movement got off the ground. And most importantly, the songwriter who was responsible for the legendary Nature Boy recorded by Nat King Cole, and subsequently transformed into an American standard for all time. While Nature Boy may be Eden Abe's most mainstream and well-known accomplishment, and how the viewer may have first heard of him, if you've heard of him, there is a vastness to the life, work, philosophy, and mysticism of Eden Abe that deserves wider awareness. He often called the combination of all these elements of his being Eden's Island, a utopian society where all men could live together in harmony. In this video, going over the life, music, and philosophy of Eden Abe, I hope that I can personally do justice to his vision of Eden's Island. Eden Abe was born George Alexander Averill in Brooklyn, New York on April 15, 1908, to a Jewish father and a Scots-Irish mother. Abe's parents were unfortunately destitute at the time of his birth, and he was subsequently placed in the Brooklyn Hebrew Orphans Asylum. From there, he was adopted by a Kansas couple, one Mr. and Mrs. W.A. McGrew. He was then renamed George McGrew. He spent his youth growing up in Kansas City, playing piano in various dance bands around town, before moving to New York for a brief time in his 20s. After drifting about throughout the continental United States, he ended up in Los Angeles in 1941. He then found work playing piano in a small health food store on Laurel Canyon Boulevard called Eutrophion, owned by John and Vera Richter, German immigrants. John and Vera were heavily influenced by the ideology of Wandervogel, a German ideology focused on natural living and connection with spirituality as a part of daily life. Some of the employees of Eutrophion, as well as characters who hung around the store, came to be known in the early 1940s as the Nature Boys. You see where this is going? McGrew, as he was known at this time, who was, again, the piano player at a health food store, don't question it, ended up falling in with this nascent Nature Boy movement, and ended up growing his hair, changing his wardrobe to long flowing garments, and switching to a strict vegetarian diet, and, most importantly, changing his name from George McGrew to the lowercase Eden Abe. His justification for the lowercase nature of his name was that only the words God and infinity should be capitalized. Keep in mind, this was the early 1940s, not the late 1960s. To call Eden Abe a pioneer of the hippie counterculture would be an understatement. Not only that, as I said earlier, this was roughly 15 years before the beatnik movement, which in and of itself was a precursor to the hippie movement. So again, for Eden Abe, pioneer is an understated description of the man at this time. Now, for much of the 1940s, Eden Abe lived a bucolic life in early post-war Los Angeles. He met and married a woman named Ann Jacobson, continued his advocacy of vegetarianism, spent time street preaching the benefits of Eastern mysticism. Again, remember, this is the 1940s and the man looked like this. During this period in the 1940s, he also spent some time famously camping under the Hollywood sign with his wife and newborn baby, being able to live on, quote, $3 a day, according to him. Keep in mind inflation, folks. And so this existence of bumming around LA while living under the Hollywood sign, playing piano at a German health food store, and preaching the benefits of Eastern mysticism continued till about 1947. During the course of the preceding years, leading up to 1947, Eden Abe had composed quite a bit of music in various styles, mostly with jazz, classical, and exotica influences. Again, remember, rock and roll was not a thing yet. However, one particular song caught the attention of his inner circle. This song was, of course, Nature Boy. It's not hard to see why. To this day, it still possesses a haunting musical beauty and poetic lyrics of a wish for a life lived in accordance with man's natural and spiritual state of existence, as opposed to his state of confusion and trouble due to modernity. Due to the enthusiasm and spurring on by friends and his employers, the Richters, Abe managed to approach Nat King Cole's manager with the sheet music for Nature Boy backstage after a show at the Lincoln Theater. Nat King Cole's manager was receptive after viewing the sheet music, and Nat King Cole ended up testing the song live to audiences and saw that their reaction was wholly positive. Following this, Cole became highly enthusiastic about recording Nature Boy professionally and releasing it as singles. However, there was a bit of a hold-up recording the song, as Nat King Cole and his manager were unable to locate Abe to get the rights to record the song due to his transient nature around LA. Nonetheless, weeks later, Eden Abe was finally located and agreed to allow Nat King Cole to record Nature Boy. The song was released in 1948 and subsequently became an astounding hit on the Billboard charts, hitting #1 for 8 straight weeks. This, of course, led to increased scrutiny of the man who had penned the song. Most Americans in 1948 were, to put it lightly, conservative to moderate conservative in their social values and ethics. So what a shock it must have been to not only have a song sung about man connecting spiritually with nature reach #1 for 2 months, sung by a black man, might I add, but then to discover that the author of this song was in every way the embodiment of its very values. Long hair, dressed as a mystic, rejecting meat consumption, and the emerging crass consumerist culture. This must have caused both shock and a tepid curiosity among the American public to understand what Eden Abe was all about. As we know now, Nature Boy ended up becoming a classic of all time and still endures to this day. However, Nature Boy was not the end of Abe's career. In fact, it was just the beginning. Due to the publishing royalties Abe was paid from Nature Boy, he was able to financially support himself much more easily, though he still retained his ascetic lifestyle. And because of the notoriety he achieved due to Nature Boy, he was able to pursue music in a much more involved way, given that his financial situation had stabilized. Though true to Abe's nature, he did not rush anything. From 1948 to 1959, Abe continued to go about life in much the way he was before, though now spending his days writing, composing, and collaborating with other musicians. Many of the compositions from this time were recorded by other artists, including Eartha Kitt recording Hey Jacques, Sam Cooke recording Lonely Island, Frankie Laine recording a couple of songs as well, and his old boss Nat King Cole coming back around for another batch of quality songs. All this further brought in money and allowed him to continue his artistic spiritual life. The culmination of these 11 years of experimenting, composing, and creating ended up becoming the album known as Eden's Island. Recorded in 1959 and released in 1960, Eden's Island was a roughly 45 minutes long exploration of the exotica genre in all its facets. If you don't know what exotica is, I've made a separate video about it that you can check out, but basically it's a version of lounge music that takes inspiration from jazz, late 19th century classical music, Polynesian instruments, and some Latin rhythms, along with real or imitated animal sounds. While most exotica is instrumental, Abe decided to subvert this and turn it into a vocal genre filled with spoken word poetry and slightly sung lyrics based around mystical poetry he had written. In addition, when Abe does include instrumentals on the album, such as Trade Winds, we get instrumental exotica sweetness and trippiness to rival the best of Martin Denny or Les Baxter, the well-known kings of exotica at the time. Now, to me, the album is utterly fascinating, and I would call it an example of pre-rock psychedelia, along with the albums of Ima Sumac and Les Baxter in the exotica genre. Oh, and this guy, who basically, in my opinion, invented the concept of psychedelia. Following the release of Eden's Island, Abe self-financed a mini tour around the US, playing in coffee houses, bookshops, and yes, health food stores. But then, as now, he mostly remained in deep obscurity, limited to no knowledge among the general public. Throughout the 1960s, he released a few more singles which appear to be mostly lost at this time. In addition, throughout the 1960s, Nature Boy was covered countless times, and most notably, Abe appeared in photos during the recording sessions for the Beach Boys' legendary Smile album in 1967, which contained many hints of the exotica style Abe had been exploring a decade earlier. I've made a separate documentary all about the making and recording of Smile for more info on that subject. However, aside from these forays to the outer regions of popular consciousness throughout the 60s, Eden Abe mostly stayed unknown for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st century, save for the fact that Nature Boy remained omnipresent in the contemporary music canon. However, However, had I released this video but a few years earlier, this is where I would probably have ended it. However, thanks to the team behind an upcoming documentary about the life of Eden Abe, in 2020 we saw the release of our first new batch of Eden Abe songs in 60 years. The album, Wild Boy, The Songs of Eden Abe, reveals a side to the man, artist, and mystic that had previously been heretofore unknown, and reveals so much musically I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. As previously mentioned, this second release by Abe falls into the category of pre-rock psychedelia in my opinion. On songs like India and Child of Nature, we get songs written in standard jazz forms, 32 bar, AABA, and the like. However, the lyrics are just not something any other artist at the time would have written. In the song India, we have lyrics about the gloriousness of spiritual knowledge to be found in the Indian subcontinent well before the late 1960s excursion there by the Beatles. And throughout the rest of the album we get these wonderful pieces like Anna, which is more like a melange or series of fragments of songs, but within the piece we get some beautiful haunting minor key Debussy style piano and some mid-19th century style folk guitar playing that is just gorgeous and again proves that someone did not have to come from the quote rock era to produce spacious, trippy, solemn, mystical, gorgeous music. There are also, amazingly, 2 recorded versions of Nature Boy here in instrumental and vocal version that take a much more psychedelic jazz approach than the Nat King Cole version, which again brings a new dimension and texture to the song. In songs like Hey Jacques and Land of Love, we get a French jazz-inspired psychedelic sound that again emphasizes Abe's unique musical vision, informed in my opinion by Debussy. And further, on songs like Wild Boy, we get a primal version of exotica with whoops, hollers, guttural and animal noises, and that classic exotica Latin rhythm powering the song. At the end of the album, and presumably this coincides with the end of the 60s, we hear Abe moving and experimenting with the familiar psychedelic rock genre that most of us are familiar with in songs like Surfer John and Overcomers of the World. Though in these songs, Abe does not come as a disciple of psychedelia, but as a great elder and progenitor of the mindset before the term psychedelia had even come to be used to describe this blissful, self-aware state that the music envisions. We should all be grateful to the filmmakers, Brian Chidester and John Weiner, from the upcoming Eden Abe documentary, for making this music available to all of us and illustrating how truly special and unique Eden Abe was as a musical artist. The film, entitled As the When, still needs support, so I'll leave a link to the Indiegogo campaign as well as their YouTube channel in the description. So who was Eden Abe? Musician? Proto-hippie? Mystic? Philosopher? Visionary? Yes, Eden Abe was a true American frontiersman. In a time of extreme conformity immediately following the post-war, he dared to explore the esoteric and spiritual aspect of human existence. He danced to his own drum and as a result was able to tap into some deep spiritual force, reward us with the beauty that is Nature Boy, let alone his vast collection of personal music that has recently been released. To say he was one of the truly individual characters in the vast American story would be an understatement. Eden Abe is a shining example of how living your truth may not always be understood by the masses, but so long as it is understood by you yourself, then life will never steer you wrong. Please, I hope you will take the time to check out his brief 2-album discography, as well as explore the glory that is Nature Boy. Eden Abe is truly a one-of-a-kind artist in the history of American music, and a one-of-a-kind icon in American history, music aside. And that is why, in my opinion, his legacy should no longer be lost.
Oh.